while in progress. So good morning, everybody. This is Jennifer Nugent, and welcome to the Regional Catastrophic Preparedness Grant Program, otherwise known as RCPGP or REGGIE's, informational webinar on the results of a recent analysis conducted by the University of Delaware's renowned Disaster Research Center on whether or not emergency responders will be willing to report for duty in the case of a catastrophic incident. Our keynote speaker today is Dr. Joseph Trainer from the University of Delaware. My name is Jennifer Nugent, and I am the program coordinator for the RCPGP projects. Please note that I am shown on your screen as Tom Moran, so if you have any questions for me, chat with Tom Moran. So before we begin, I'd like to provide a few housekeeping items and let you know how you can participate in today's event. This webinar will be recorded, and this recording will be distributed to the attendees for later use along with the full report and the slides. For today's call, we are going to leave the phones unmuted to encourage dialogue. If you have any background noises, we do ask that you mute your phones now. When you ask a question, please identify yourself and go ahead and feel free to speak freely. We will reserve some time at the end for Q&A. There are two ways you can participate for questions. As we said, you can just ask your question while online, or you can type your question in the questions panel that is shown on your screen. And if you do that, I will announce your question for you and tell them your name while we're doing that. If you'd like any further information on any of the other 17 projects that are part of the FEMA Region 3 RCPGP, please contact me at jennifer.nugent@ahcusa.org. Now, at this time, I'd like to introduce Janet Clements. Janet is the Program Manager for the 2008 RCPGP project on behavioral analysis. Janet is a former Deputy Director of the Virginia Department of Emergency Management. In that role, she was the primary architect of the behavioral analysis study, which served as a cornerstone for all the other RCPGP projects. Since leaving VDEM, Janet has continued to guide this project as well as the follow-on shelter-in-place project. So I'd like to go ahead and turn it over to Janet. Janet?
Thank you, Jennifer, and good morning to everyone. As I introduce this presentation, I want to give you a little bit of history of why we decided to study this issue. After the original University of Virginia, they did the survey of the National Capital Region on using a dirty bomb scenario and to determine whether people would evacuate or whether they would stay put when told to do so. So during those discussions at various committees, we had, especially from the Fire Chiefs Committee and the NCR, a request of looking at if we were telling the citizens to shelter in place, would first responders show up? What is the, what are the research? What's the research on this? Because that's obviously a very big issue. You need, in a catastrophic event, you're going to need even more people than you even have on staff. So will those that you have on staff be willing to show up in incidents? So we went to the University of Delaware. Their Disaster Research Center is one of only 2 research centers of its type in the country. We're fortunate to have that here in the Mid-Atlantic, and asked them to look at this particular issue. And I think that's what you're going to hear today is Dr. Joe Trainer, who is the lead investigator for this particular research, will share with you what he found. So I'd like to now turn it over to Dr. Trainer.
Sure. Good morning, everybody. I appreciate everybody coming out to listen to this talk. We're going to keep it pretty informal here. We're going to give you the information that we can, and really encourage anybody who has questions, issues, concerns, worries, things that they want to talk about to go ahead and interrupt me at any point. We're glad to talk with in any detail about what we did. As we mentioned here, this is the reporting for duty report. This is the presentation version. There is also a more extended report of this. It has a nice short 5-page, 3-page executive summary that's got some good high points, and then a little bit longer, it's about a 30-page explanation of all the details from what we're going to talk about here. What we're going to try to do today is just hit the high points and give you a sense of what we did and what some of the major findings are. So we'll go ahead and get started. So the main question here is, will responders report for duty, right? We've talked about this before. And we really have kind of broken this down in a couple of different ways. I think that you've got to answer this question in two ways if you're going to use the existing research base. So the first question, for most organizations during most disasters, the answer is yes, that responders are going to show up. And what are we talking about here? We're talking about major disaster events. We're talking about things like hurricanes, tornadoes, earthquakes. Almost all of these disaster events that we've come to respond to regularly here in the United States. Most of the research is going to say that, yeah, the people are going to be there for those events. The next question, though, is what about major catastrophes? And that's really been the focus of this project. What do we know about what's going to happen during a major catastrophe? And I think there's a lot of scenarios that have been kicked around, dirty bombs. We talk about a pandemic, epidemic situations. We talk about nuclear kinds of events. So what's the answer here is they probably will. And that's an interesting thing because a lot of the speculation has been in the last couple of years that responders are not going to show up. But we think that they probably will. But we know that if your organization gets itself ready right now, the answer is yes. And I think this is one of the really important focuses that you should take away from what we did, is that people probably are going to show up, but there's a lot of things that organizations can do right now to make that go from a probably to a yes. And we provide some details in this report and in this analysis on exactly things that you can do to move yourself from the no category, if you happen to be there, which there may be some organizations that do fall, into the probably, or from the probably to the yes. And that's really what this presentation is about. That's what we're going to try to help you understand how to get into that yes category. So we're going to take a quick step back here first. And I think the first question is, why do we care about this, right? Why are we worried about role abandonment to begin with? And I think I just want to highlight a couple things, right? The first thing is Hurricane Katrina. And I think the reason why Hurricane Katrina has sparked our interest, the numbers speak for themselves, 240 out of 1,450, 51 officers in the New Orleans Police Department were fired. So when you break down the numbers, we're between 3 and 16% actually abandoned their posts. So the 3% is that 51 that were fired. The 16% is this 240 that initially was reported to have abandoned their posts. Obviously, this is a big deal. If responders aren't showing up for work in an event like Hurricane Katrina, it makes you worried, right? It makes you wonder, are they going to be here for other kinds of disasters? And I think the other real focus here is H1N1. Everyone knew about, we did a lot of talking about H1N1 that happened both in terms of emergency management and on the public health side. And after H1N1, there's been a whole flood of surveys, particularly from public health agencies and from actually departments doing their own studies. And we're looking at numbers between 20% and 68% of responders in some of those studies saying they're unwilling or unable to actually work. And this has made a lot of people nervous, right? And essentially what this breaks down to is planners asking, are people going to show up when we need them the most? So that's what this analysis is really focused on, understanding better. And I think that these numbers are so scary and this scenario is so scary that it's really asked a lot of people to wonder about it. I think that what we decided, or what we wanted to focus on, is that this is not a new issue. Although we've got a renewed interest in it in the last couple of years, it's not new altogether. And I just wanted to highlight a couple of things real quick. Our center actually has been working on this issue for a long, long time, with our first studies actually published in 1964 after the Great Alaska Earthquake. If people are familiar with this, a lot of times in this community we might have some memory, but a really humongous earthquake in the Anchorage area. It's for its time one of the most major disasters that had occurred in the United States. So we did some work after that event, and then we also did a lot of experimental or lab studies of how responders react and act during stressful situations, and how people in general act and react in stressful situations. And between when we did this study in 1964, we actually weren't even the first ones. There were other people before that had been doing work. Between that and 2009 or 2010 when we finished this analysis, there's been a lot more work done. So what did we do, actually? What did we work on? We did a scientific analysis of research on whether or not emergency responders are willing to report for duty. And I think it's important to focus on that willing part. We did not focus on whether people will be able to respond. So there is a dimension that we didn't look at here. What if people are sick themselves, or what if people are incapacitated themselves? That's not what we're focused on. What we're focused on here is the willingness of people who are able to actually come and do their work. So I think it's important to look at that, because there are some dimensions that should be looked at, particularly from a public health perspective or an epidemiological perspective, about what proportion or what part of your responders might get sick themselves. But we're not focusing on that. What we're really focused on here is the people that can, will they come? And for us, there's really three different key issues: role conflict, role strain, and role abandonment. Abandonment here is the one that's gotten the most attention in terms of press coverage and concern, but strain and conflict are also particularly important. And in a couple seconds here, I'll describe what the differences between those things actually are. So in our project, I just want to say what we did is we looked at studies from 1950 to 2010. So obviously covered 60 years worth of research on a whole bunch of different kinds of events: natural hazards, nuclear hazards, terrorist events, even public health events. We looked at scenarios where people asked what they might do in hypothetical situations. So that we call these perception studies. What would you do if? And then we also looked at studies that asked what people actually did after real events, right? So you have a disaster, you have a major accident, you have a biological agent, or you have some kind of major response. And we go in and we looked at studies about how people actually responded to those events. So I think it's just important to understand a little bit about where we got this information from. The old adage, right? Garbage in, garbage out. If you've got we've got a good comprehensive focus here, and I just want you to have some sense of how we collected this information. It's really not a good idea to base your organizational planning assumptions on one single study. You can use that as a base, but you should reflect not only on what's going on there, but what's going on in other places. And the reason for that is there's some variation in how researchers collect information. Different survey wording matters, and those kinds of things can really influence the kind of responses that you actually are going to get. So what we've done here is we've looked across a whole bunch of different approaches to asking the question, and we brought it all together to try to give you a sense of what can I do with that? What can I find out? Again, it's not the report from a single study or survey. It's not a set of interviews. It's not a single analysis, right? It's important that you recognize that what we're doing is we're looking at all the research and all the literature. The other thing, it's not focused on different types of responders. It's important to look at that. When we talk about responders, we're talking across domains. We're not separating what police do from what firefighters do, from what doctors do, from what nurses do. And the reason why we're not is because there's a lot of studies, there's almost 200 as a matter of fact, but there's not enough that focus on multiple kinds of responders. There's a lot of them that there's not enough that focus on single sets of responders that you can really get a reliable sense of what the differences between these groups are. So it's something that we actually are trying to get some attention on at some point here. So what is it? What is this actually? Again, we said it's a review of 200 studies, just about 200 studies focused on role conflict, strain, and abandonment, a set of conclusions based on the whole body of research rather than one single analysis. And then it's also a set of recommendations. So we went beyond saying, well, this is what the analysis of the research says, to some focused suggestions on so what. So we've got all this information, so what can you actually do with it? So that we tried to focus on that. All right, so I said before, role strain, role conflict, role abandonment. There's three different things we focused on. So let's look at them first. Strain is actually about individuals trying to meet the expectations of their job, basically. We say role here. Role is a word sociologists use to talk about all the expectations that go with something that you're supposed to do, right? So being a dad, there's certain roles associated. Being a mom, there's certain expectations. Those are roles. Being an emergency manager, that's another role. So the idea is, as an emergency manager, as a firefighter, as a police officer, as a nurse, whatever it is, there's a whole set of expectations that employers have for what you should and shouldn't be doing. Role strain is about the tension that individuals feel when they're trying to do the things their job wants them to do. So it's important. That's the first kind of thing. Role conflict, on the other hand, is about when you're the multiple roles in your life, right? So we talk about people, you say all the time, I wear two hats, right? I'm a dad, and I'm a professor, and I'm a consultant, and I'm a researcher. Each one of those positions in my life has different kinds of expectations. And the truth is that sometimes they're asking different things of me, right? One person, one job wants me to do one thing, one wants to do something else. Most often in this context, when we talk about role conflict, we're talking about the tension between your home life and your work life. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. And then finally, role abandonment. And role abandonment, what role abandonment actually is when somebody really just dismisses their responsibilities and leaves, right? It's like quitting the job, basically. And it's important to realize that we focused a lot on role abandonment, but that's really just one potential outcome. There can be, and it's usually an outcome of either this role conflict or this role strain. So it's important to focus in on that so that you have some sense of where role abandonment falls. There's a lot of other things that people can do in response to strain and conflict. They can work less effectively. They can work less efficiently. They can kind of split their responsibilities. So there's a lot of responses that don't go all the way to the extreme of quitting the job or quitting what's going on. So it's important to, again, I think, to separate those things. All right. So what do the studies actually say? What are we actually finding out? So let's start with this role strain, right? The idea that people are trying to do their jobs, that the job places a lot of expectations on them. How do people navigate through the things their jobs want them to do? And the truth is, the research across all of these studies finds that a lot of people have the tension when they're trying to deal with the work expectations during disasters. For anybody who's actually been in a disaster response before, this is not surprising to you, right? There's a lot of things going on. There's a lot of tension. There's a lot of expectation. There's a lot of intensity during these kinds of events, and it's sometimes difficult for people to navigate those tensions and those problems. And I think when we transfer this and we're looking at the catastrophic kind of events, the strain typically comes from a couple of things. Concern about individuals' own health and safety, right? Again, we've got good examples of this, reflections of 9/11, right? People who are on the site worried about, is there going to be another attack? Is there going to be a dust cloud? People are worried in an H1N1, a pandemic kind of scenario or a biological scenario. Am I going to be exposed to these things, and is it going to hurt me? So that's the first source of strain. The next thing is the absence of information. So people going into these things with no expectation for how much exposure they're actually being asked to take on, why they're being asked to take it on, what they can do to protect themselves. So it's just not knowing makes it difficult for people to do the things because there's this concern because they don't have enough information to know what kind of exposure they're actually taking or not. The next one, reduce belief in organizational continuity. What are we saying here, basically? We're saying people who think that the organization is going to fail anyway, right? If I think that this organization is going to collapse no matter what I do, I'm going to be less likely to be committed to the kind of work that's going on here, right? So it's important to focus on that. And then again, a perception that the expectations about what they can or should do are unreasonable. So if I think that the job is asking too much of me, then obviously I'm going to have some tensions here, and I'm not going to want I'm going to have less likely to do the things the job wants. So that's role strain. Next thing, role conflict. Again, people often experience this tension, and what we're talking about typically in this example is work and home. And we're talking about what are the things that in your home, your family expect of you. What are the things that your work expects from you? And we say that there's a lot of people that experience the tension and the balancing act during a disaster or an extended event where they're trying to understand what does my family want and what do these other people want, and it's important to take a look at that. Again, key sources of conflict for work-home uncertainty regarding your family's safety. So if I'm on the job and a major event happens, I want to get in contact with my family and know that they're okay. If I'm not sure of that, there's a tension there, right? People may lose their effectiveness, they may be less efficient, and again, there's some threat of that possibility for abandonment because they're trying until they know what's going on with their family. And then the second thing is responders feeling they should be doing something to help their family and friends, right? So if their family is in the impacted zone or the potentially impacted area, people might say, well, I should be helping the people that my loved ones. I should be there with them. So that tension exists for people. So both role strain and role conflict are very common feelings for emergency responders during major kinds of disasters events. It's very likely that they will continue to be major problems and issues for responders during a catastrophic event or a disaster. So, any questions so far on that material, on that section?
Joe, this is Jennifer Nugent. We had a question from Jamie Turner, and what is the correlation between leadership issues and the study? Sure.
That's a good question. We talk about leadership. Matter of fact, we're going to get to this a little bit further down the line. We focus not so much on leadership, but actually on some of the organization's preparations and dimension, some of the things that organizations can do. Leadership, I think the thing where leadership is going to matter the most is in helping to clarify those expectations before an event and having that open and clear communication with employees during an event. So to be able to say, hey, look, we're asking you to go into this area. You are taking some kind of risk. This is the risk you're likely taking. This is what we've done to protect you from that risk. And that gives people a lot more confidence and comfort if they know that leaders are being clear, consistent, and open and honest with people, right? And look, the truth is that most of the people in these kinds of positions take risks in their job all the time. It's not that people are unwilling to take any kinds of risks. It's that they don't know how much risk they're taking in some of these kinds of situations because they don't have as much information about these less likely, more uncertain, more infrequent kinds of events. So in terms of leadership, I think when we get towards the back end, we're going to talk a little bit about the things involved in organizations' design that influence these feelings and things that can be done in order to help people feel more confident and comfortable both beforehand and during the actual event. So I definitely think leadership has a major influence on how intense these feelings are, and we can talk we'll talk a little bit as we get towards the back on some of the things that leaders can do in order to help kind of work on those tensions.
And a follow-up question was, in the study, was the role that the organization's family safety and security plan considered?
It absolutely is. So what we actually are doing down in the backhand side of this, and we'll get to that part in a couple of slides here. The people that have those plans in place, the people that have the organizations that have those plans in place are much better prepared, or are much more likely. Employees that feel like those things are taken care of are much less likely to experience these kinds of tensions. The intensity is going to be reduced. I think that's really what's important here. I think a lot of times where we are concerned about, can we get rid of this altogether? I don't know that you can get rid of it altogether, but what you can do is reduce it to a level that the tension doesn't disrupt the way that people are doing their jobs. And I think that actually we can see that there's a lot of things that can be done within organizations to keep it that way. And I guess that's one of the things I want to say here. I don't want you to say that I don't want you to take away from this that I'm saying that these are to the level that it's destroying the operations, or that this is to the level where people can't do anything. I think quite to the opposite. We see a lot of times people really struggle through these tensions, even though they feel them. So I think that's what we're going to get to when we get to the next slide. We'll see that. Other questions? All right, so we'll go on then. Another type of role conflict. There's not a whole lot of research on this second type of role conflict. We call it two-hat syndrome, but I really think it's something that there should be some attention placed on by emergency management organizations. And basically what this is an observation. It came out of some studies in Atlanta, actually, where they're talking about emergency responders and emergency workers who actually have multiple public safety positions. So a person who's an EMT in one station has a full-time job, and then as a part-time staffer at another station in a close jurisdiction. And I know I've got family in EMS. It's pretty common, actually, from my experience. I've never seen it in the study, but there's some suggestions here that this has become more and more common across the nation. So it's important to think about roles and different expectations cut across the public safety system in a broader sense. If you have an expectation that you've got your full-time staff and all of your part-time staff, but part of the part-time staff are actually full-timers in jurisdictions adjacent to yours, that's going to have an impact or an effect on the availability of staff for major catastrophic events. So it's important to think a little bit about what your employees' other work or other expectations are in terms of even public safety positions, so that when this kinds of things, if and when these major catastrophic events emerge, you have a better sense of who is actually likely to report to your particular organization, not because who is likely to not report, but not because they don't care about it, but because they're actually working for somebody else in that same event. So again, that's something. There's not a whole lot of research on this, but it's definitely the study that I saw, that the one that I focused on in the study a little bit in the extended write-up. It says the number might be in some jurisdictions into the 20%, 23% range of the staff are actually working in multiple public safety positions over multiple organizations. So something to take a look at in terms of thinking about campaign-style operations where you expect multiple shifts and second staff. So I definitely think that's something that should be focused on a little bit more. All right, so role abandonment. We're getting to this is the hot button topic, right? This is the third rail issue, the one that everybody is particularly concerned about. And I guess when we look at the literature, this is actually the most difficult one to make sense of. Unlike the previous studies where people definitely have strains, they're working through them, people definitely have role conflicts, they're working through them. The question here about role abandonment is, are those strains and conflicts going to get to the point where people give up and quit? And when we look at the literature, again, we look at about 200 studies here, there's really two sides to the argument. There's one group that says that role abandonment by public and government officials is basically a myth, that there's been a long-standing concern for this, that it doesn't really play out, and when it does, it's in numbers that are actually small enough that it doesn't really affect the organization's operations, 1%, 2%, maybe 3%. So it doesn't really have a meaningful effect on the ability of organizations to do their jobs. On the other side, we've got a group of people that say role abandonment is going to be really serious, really severe, dire consequences. And again, some of these studies report up to 68, 70% of the people are not going to show up. So there's these two sides of the research, and you can see how it creates tension for people that are trying to make planning assumptions based on the science. Right? I've got one side saying it's nothing, and the other side saying this is the worst thing that's ever going to happen. So how do you make sense of this stuff? I mean, what do you do? How do you use the science to inform your planning assumptions? How do you use the science to make decisions? And I think that's where we really can come in. We really, in this report, are trying to help out. We looked more deeply at how the studies are actually conducted. Remember when I said garbage in, garbage out? I want you to know how we did the study. That's kind of it's a dramatic thing, right? I'm not calling any of these studies garbage. But there are differences in how people collect the information. There's differences in how they ask the questions. And it's important to look at those differences and how the process for asking questions, how the process for analyzing the research informs the kind of conclusions that these studies have actually come out with. And that's part of what the focus that we actually did. All right, so how do we make sense of this? And I think in a lot of ways, much of the divide comes when you look at the difference between behavioral research and perception research. It's not completely true. Behavioral research tends to say that's not going to be a problem. Perception research, remember that's the one where you provide a scenario and ask people how they might act and react, tend to say that there's going to be more role abandonment, more likelihood that responders will not come out to work. So let me, really quick, going to talk a little bit about the differences in how these two sets of studies collect the information. In behavioral studies, what we've got is we've got an event that's already happened. Something goes down, and it's already out there. There's a real live disaster. And researchers go to those events and look at behaviors, they look at thoughts, they look at actions that were actually experienced in the aftermath of a real event. The benefit of these kind of studies is that behavior is a good predictor of future behavior, right? So the things that you do right now are a good predictor of the things that you will do in the future. If human beings tend to be more repetitive in their actions than change-oriented. As a downside, though, there is somewhat of a limit. These findings are limited by the kinds of events that you've looked at, right? And I think that makes a lot of sense. If I've been to all tornadoes, there's some room to question if the things that I've seen in how people respond to tornadoes, does that transfer over to a hurricane, or what about an earthquake, or what about a dirty bomb scenario, or a pandemic or an epidemic? So there are some limits, but again, behavioral studies have a good predictor of the future. They're actual events that happen, so you get a lot of nuance about what's actually going to go on. That's behavioral studies. Perception studies, on the other hand, it's a scenario, right? So I give you a setup or a situation. I ask you to think about what you would do in that scenario. So it's like a hypothetical kind of setup or situation. One of the benefits of these kind of studies, they tend to be more quantitative, which planners love. It allows us to create counts, percentages, graphs, charts, where most of the behavioral studies are more qualitative, where they're interviews with emergency managers, asking about how their organization operates, or police chiefs, or fire captains, or we're looking at these people, we're asking, how do things work in your organization? And it's a more qualitative analyses. The perception research, you can get hard numbers because we've got tends to be surveys, and it makes people more comfortable. If I tell you 30% are going to do this or that, it's more definitive, and it's a more solid, it's an easier number it's easier to take those numbers and use them for plans and policies for people. So that's one of the reasons why these things get a lot of press and attention. They also allow people to explore what-if scenarios. So unlike the previous behavioral studies where you need a bad thing to happen, we can create scenarios in a perception study that we haven't experienced yet and try to see what people will and won't do in those kinds of scenarios. So there's some benefit to that kind of setup. The problem, though, is that the scenario itself has a significant effect on the responses, right? So what do I mean by that? If I ask you, if I put you in a situation where the world is collapsing around you and ask you what you're going to do, it's very different than if I put you in a situation where there's a couple of people coughing and I ask you, what are you going to do now? And that difference or that variation from a really extreme kind of scenario to a less severe scenario, or the kinds of information I do and don't give you in the scenario. So if I only tell you about one dimension of the problem, you don't get all the other elements that might be going on around you in your organization, or all the other training that might have happened, or you don't get any of that kind of information. So you're limited in some way to being able to put yourself in a realistic situation, because you're limited by, what can a paragraph actually tell you about about the context that you'll have to make that choice in. So again, these two different kinds of studies are put up. Again, limits on behavior. Can something that's been focused on, can findings from a tornado be used to predict what's going to happen in a hurricane, right? And similarly, can findings from natural disasters be used to predict what's going to happen in major catastrophic events, or can smaller events predict what's going to happen in larger events? There's some tension there. There's limits on perception. Again, scenarios. Most of the scenarios, in my professional opinion, have been fairly poorly designed when it comes to the perception studies for role abandonment. The scenarios don't give a lot of realism in terms of what that situation would actually look like, right? So a lot of times we'll give people the perception of how risky a situation is with no information about what protective equipment's available to them, with no information about the disease, what the disease is looking like, or the reports on the disease. So that we ask questions like this: will you be willing to continue treating patients in the event of an outbreak of an unknown but potentially deadly illness. And the issue is when you ask a question like this, you've already told someone that there's an outbreak. You've already told them that the illness is unknown. It's potentially deadly. All these kinds of things are, each one of these things are perceptions that would evolve over time. People would stop and think as more individuals were getting sick or as something was happening. All these things are going to evolve in a context where things are going on inside of your organization, things are going on in the broader society. There's a lot of other things that are going on around this before you get to this situation that are going to influence what you do, that are just completely eliminated from the scenarios. And it's really important to think a little bit about that, right? Because, for instance, we don't know that you've already started working with the responders in your group, that all of the people in your platoon have decided, this is a really important event, we want to be there, right? It doesn't talk about the culture of within firefighting and professional services wanting to be at the big one, right? We know that this is something that happens a lot, right? People don't want to miss the big fire. They won't want to miss the big events. They want to be part of it. People who got into these kinds of positions were there to do public service, typically. So it's important to think about that. And the limits of the scenarios that don't allow some of these other contextual elements into how people actually make choices and decisions about what they're going to do. And again, take a step back to H1N1 again. Right? This was an event with an outbreak of an unknown, potentially deadly illness. I mean, that's exactly what was going on. Right? Splashed across the headlines in the news all the time we don't know how virulent this is. We don't know how fast it spreads. We don't know what kind of strain it is. All that information was exactly like that in the beginning. Did we see large groups of people abandon their posts in that scenario? The truth is we really didn't. So the question is, there's something that goes on between these, this kind of scenario where you have all these elements and people's actually behavior and response during real life events that it doesn't always match up. All right. So what are we going to say? What are our conclusions here? When you're looking at science and you're trying to reconcile differences between these kinds of studies, typically you give greater weight to the behavioral results over perception when there's direct comparisons that are possible, right? So if I'm looking at a perception study of what I'm going to do in a H1N1 outbreak, or a perception study of what am I going to do in an anthrax outbreak versus a behavioral study, you typically give more weight to the behavioral study. And the idea is it's because it's something that someone's actually done and something that someone's actually, it's an actual context and event, real life actions, real life responses, as opposed to the other literature. And when we do this comparison for all the kinds of events where we have that capability, for most disasters, responders are going to show up. There are very, very few substantiated or documented instances of mass roll abandonment. The most famous is that New Orleans event. It's definitely the only one that in recent times where we see really widespread numbers of abandonment that have been, or some even meaningful numbers of abandonment that have been predicted. It doesn't mean that people have never abandoned their posts. It means that typically if it happens, it's one or two people, maybe, not large numbers of people that are leaving. There's some additional weight that additional weight for additional focus here that I think is important. When we're looking at the predictions of widespread roll abandonment from the perception studies, right? We've talked about that in some scenarios they're saying 70% of people aren't going to show up. It's important, I think, that there's some evidence that the way that information has been collected across these studies increases the prediction or the proportion of people that are probably the estimates of the number of people that are going to abandon. And I just want to put out a couple things for you. It's very common for the perception kind of studies to have comparisons across different kinds of events. And so if you take a look here at this particular example, snowstorm 80%, mass casualty 85%, disasters, SARS, radiation, smallpox, and a chemical. What typically happens in the conclusions is the write-up here says, well, look, as you go through larger and larger, or different kinds of more uncertain, more virulent, more personally effective kind of events, there's going to be more and more abandonment. And there is some evidence for that, right? People are reporting here that they're less likely to show up in these different kinds of uncertain events. What I want to focus attention on, though, here is let's go back to the snowstorm number, right? Think for your own jurisdiction. When's the last time for a snowstorm that you had 20% of your staff unwilling to show up? And I think that most people are going to say that it just doesn't happen that way. Same thing with disasters. The last time that for a major disaster event, that 15% of the staff didn't show up. And I think the reason why it's important to take a look at those, mass casualty, 15%, right? It's important to look at those because I think that most people in their own reflections will see that doesn't jive with your personal experiences. And I think that what it kind of starts to show is some of what we call systematic bias, or it's a bias in the way the data is collected that increases those numbers systematically across all of these kinds of hazards. I think it's important to think a little bit about that. So again, we're saying that I think that many of these studies are overstating in their conclusions the degree of abandonment that's likely in a systematic kind of way. But there is something to focus back on. The chances are, so what we're saying basically, for most major disasters and events, abandonment is not going to be as big an issue as many people have thought it was recently. But there is a chance that likelihood of abandonment is going to increase some during highly contagious, hazardous threats like biological, nuclear, and public health threats. It's very difficult. There's no way for a scientist to say exactly how much more concern there is or how much worse that's going to be. Or even at this point, we can't really show you what the threshold is. We don't have good data to say, well, if you get to this point, this is when you're going to really see widespread abandonment. But I guess the main point is that there is some residual concern for those kinds of things, but it's important to see that there's it's not quite as bad as we might think. All right, but we're going to come back to the organizations again, but you're not off the hook yet. And here's why. I don't want this to be interpreted as, well, you know, behavioral studies say that abandonment's not going to happen, which means we don't have to do anything anymore. I think it's not that simple either. Again, there's caution found in these studies, particularly in the cases of pandemic, nuclear, bioterrorism event, that there is a residual threat or a potential for abandonment at some level of escalation. We don't really know what that level is right now. The existing studies are not really precise enough to give you a good estimate or measure. But I think I'm going to step back even one step further. There is compelling evidence across all of these studies that conflict and strain happen at many, many events. That those things lead to distractions, that they reduce the efficiency of organizations and reduce the effectiveness of the organizations, even if it doesn't get to the point where people are abandoning their roles. There's also compelling evidence that organizations can do things about this. A role is a set of expectations of the organization. These conflicts are about how the organization interacts with the individuals that work in the organization. There's things that organizations can do to reduce those tensions. And I think it's really important to think for emergency management organizations and emergency response organizations to really think about how they can facilitate their employees' well-being, can reduce this conflict and strain for normal events, which will also buffer against the potential for conflict or strain in more catastrophic kinds of events. All right, so we're going to step back. What kind of things that organizations can do? Organizations that have a clear sense of purpose and value, right? So if I'm part of a group and I know what I do, I know why I do it, and I know why it's important, much less likely to have problems with strain and abandonment. Cohesive culture, what do I mean? Obligation towards the group. This is, everybody's been in different kinds of organizations, and sometimes you go into a group and the people are very tight, they're connected to each other, they care about each other, they look after each other. Those kinds of organizations are much less likely to have abandonment and strain conflict because they feel a connection to the group that they work with. Organizations that train regularly, that makes sense for a lot of reasons. Organizations, again, this comes back to that leadership concern, that establish expectations before an event and during an event. So it's not just do what I say because I do it. It's this is what we're going to ask you to do, This is why we're asking you to do it. This is the risk that you're going to be exposed to, but this is why it's important that we have this kind of thing. If you establish that beforehand and build a sense that people know what they will be asked and not to do, it really will help people feel less tension. They know that they're not going to be asked to do something worse, or they can start to come to grips with it before it. Again, honest communication during an event about why they will and will not, why they are and are not being asked to take risks. Everybody knows that disaster events are dynamic. A catastrophic event is going to be even more so. So what we're trying to understand here, we're trying to give people a sense of what information is coming in, how are things changing as we go along. Again, organizations that provide support for families, this again gets back to that family responder support thing. It's not just supporting the individual themselves, but it's also supporting and protecting employees' families. So the question is, if you don't do these things, if your organization doesn't meet these descriptions, the jury's still out for you. We're saying you probably won't have a problem, but there is still a residual potential in a particularly strong kind of event, a particularly bad event that you're going to have people that don't show up. If this does meet your organization does meet these criteria, then that's much less likely to happen. You have a much stronger organization for day-to-day operations, and that strength is going to carry on into disaster kind of situations as well. So again, we're going to kick into we've got a couple of recommendations. We're just going to kick through them fairly quickly. There's more extended discussions of these in the full report. So role conflict for workers, almost always concern for families. So what are we recommending? A robust family support framework. It's really important. There's been work done on this recently. There's been responder ready programs. There's been all these kinds. So we provide a set of recommendations on the kinds of things that emergency services and emergency management organizations can do to help family support systems. Number one, facilitate family preparedness for an event. Number two, provide channels of communication from employees to their families and from families back to the employees. And then again, help to organize and plan for responder families' needs. Right? So help to organize the care of family members. Even this might be something as simple as putting together a spouse network. So some of these kinds of things will be helpful. And again, the report has a lot more detail on approaches that have been used by other emergency management organizations or concepts that have been suggested in the literature in other places. Number two, employee safety. Second set of concerns, role tensions, what we call role strain. It really revolves around the personal safety of responders. And this actually, in a lot of ways, ties back into role conflict as well, particularly for large, potentially catastrophic events. If I'm going to be asked to go out and be exposed to these kinds of hazards, I want to know what you're doing to protect me. And because of that, and I also want to know that I'm not going to be bringing that exposure back to my family. So again, it's important to take a look at what's being done to provide for the safety of public employees and provide for the safety of emergency responders. Vaccinations, antivirals, non-pharmaceutical things like masks, gloves, that are appropriate for the kinds of hazards that people are expected to be involved in. These things should be made freely available to responders. We argue when it's possible they should be available to responders' families, or at minimum there should be a reduced cost to responders' families as well. So the idea is it's not just about it's the safety of the responder and also the safety of the responder's family. We also provide a number of different solutions for this. Something like that might be more expensive, a little bit more difficult to implement. We have some less expensive things like collective purchasing agreements where you can leverage the power of large groups of organizations to reduce the cost for employees. So these are the kinds of things that we should be thinking about. And again, we should be looking at critical eye towards what kind of equipment is needed for the events that we want people to be involved in. If we think people are going to be involved in events where we're going to want them in level 3 hazmat suits, probably should have some of those around. We should probably train people on how to put them on and use them. And then the final thing is just simple education. A lot of attention comes just from not knowing about these threats. So there should be a lot of attention placed on just getting responders to understand things for these more remote threats, radiological events, unconventional things, attacks. If responders know more about it, they're going to be less likely to have problems.
Joe, I think this would be the time for a question that came in from Mr. Turner based on where you are right now.
Sure.
Have you evaluated current benchmarks in the family safety program, and are there any additional recommendations you would add to that?
So I actually have not done that. This was focused mainly on this issue, and in the suggestions that we provided here, what we rolled out was really a set of solutions that are already that are already out there. We didn't evaluate each of those solutions individually. And again, the reason this was really focused on will there be abandonment and what kinds of interventions are available already available programs, things that can be adopted with less expense and less development for people to start working on these issues. So we haven't looked in a ton of detail at each specific program and looked at the dimensions for each one. It's definitely something we had the capability to do, but we just wasn't the focus of what we were doing here. Other questions real quickly before we switch to the open Q&A? All right. So again, I think I've only got one or two more slides here before we go into open questions. So the next thing is reinforcing expectations and culture. And this is something that organizations, especially kind of organizations like EMS and firefighters and police don't think a whole lot about. There tends to be strong cultures within the organizations, right? There's a lot of connection between responder communities. It's important to facilitate that. Again, there's a lot of evidence that peer pressure from other employees helps to reduce the likelihood of abandonment. It also helps reduce the strain because people have a sense of belonging to their professional community, to their professional organization, and they don't want to disappoint the other people they work with. So again, it's important that you build those kinds of organizations where people care about what the other people are doing. They're helping to develop them, and they're working together as groups and teams. Again, they can be reinforced by clarifying expectations. There's a lot of professional standards that exist that can be reviewed. There could be a lot of discussions with employees about why what we expect from you. Again, we already know a lot about training. Training's important. I think there's really part of training is re-articulating expectations for particular kinds of events. So it's not just what might happen during this event, but what could I actually do. I think it's important especially in a live event, it's not just about assigning tasks. I think sometimes in these kind of organizations and in major disasters, there's a tendency to just assign a task and say, look, do it because we said it needs to be done. And there's a culture around that, right? That's the expectation. That's just how we do business here. But in this kind of event especially, it's important to remember that those tensions and stressors and strains are going to be here. And while you don't want people questioning every order and every request you make, there's an opportunity here to educate people and to give people a little more confidence by spending a little bit of time explaining why people are doing the things they're doing rather than just delivering directives and orders. So I think it's important to think, especially in these kinds of events, about some of the nuance of how orders and tasks are assigned and how that might relieve the tension. And again, we already talked about this. And then I think the final thing is there's been an extended amount of research on the importance of volunteers and although we haven't talked about here, but the ability of individuals, just average Joe public, to respond for themselves. So it's important to think about, what capabilities exist to handle less severe, less serious kinds of problems already in the communities. And I think that we see surges of volunteer activity, and professionals can hand off some of the less complicated, some of the less technical tasks to these kinds of volunteers. So I'll give you a good example here. Maybe one of the things that you could do is when we're concerned about spousal or support or family support, maybe you can organize some of the volunteers that show up to help provide meals for the family somewhere, or a network of responders that can help identify where family members are and whether they've been injured or hurt. So we can do these kinds of things using some of the volunteers that show up on site. So again, this has been a very high-level overview of the study. there's a lot of more detail about each of the dimensions in the analysis, and I just want to acknowledge this. Although I'm the lead in putting this project together, and a lot of assistants at the University of Delaware that worked with it, Janet really helped a lot. The University of Virginia helped a whole lot with this, and then the program is, as we mentioned, it was funded by FEMA's grant program director and the Department of Homeland Security, but these are our views and our points, so they don't necessarily reflect those agencies. They're not going to be on the hook for the things we said and did. And we'll go ahead and take any kind of questions that you might have now.
Joe, I've got another question here, and the question was, and I know you said in the beginning that you did not interview people, but was there indications in the studies that you did look at how many leaders, managers of catastrophic emergencies were interviewed?
That's a good question. So the question, I think, what makes that a hard question to answer is what you define as a catastrophic event. And you know, so I guess there have been studies done in what we would consider catastrophic kinds of events like Katrina. I think that really a lot of ways, most of what this is most of what's going on here, we don't know. I mean, because the kinds of the things that are being envisioned in the catastrophic planning scenarios are of scales that are so much larger than the kind of events that typically happen that almost all of these studies have to extend their findings some degree in order to say what is going to happen in those kinds of events. So there's a lot of variation in the kinds of events that have been looked at in terms of what type of hazard. There have been some things in SARS. The question, I guess, is what you actually define as catastrophic. And for me, you know, you're talking about really large scale, widespread events. We haven't had a whole lot of those to really do interviews and reflections on. So it's kind of a difficult question to answer.
Those are the questions I have on the panel. I'd like to open up the phone. Everybody who is connected through audio is unmuted if they'd like to ask any questions.
Hey, Joe, it's Mark Landau. How are you?
Hey, Mark, how are you?
Good. Hey, there was one thing when I was looking, and it was excellent. Thank you so much. But the one piece that came through in the recommendations that wasn't up front is that idea of role ambiguity, sure. About how, you know, if people understand their role better, you know, that's one thing. And the perception studies obviously have their limitations, but sure. You know, that's one thing that comes through in a lot of those perception studies is that, you know, people really don't understand, or responders don't understand what they may be called to do in that, and that really goes to those interventions that are so important. And you know, sometimes I think too, and this is just my own, but you know, culturally we're also changing with a differential workforce, and I think some of when we go back to the leadership things, that some of our ideas that still, you know, you show up and then, you know, I'm a sergeant, so I tell you what to do, and you're going to do it, versus them having that understanding of how it fits into the larger picture, and we find that with a lot of other things too. So thanks, Joe. I appreciate it. I guess more of a comment than a question.
Sure.
All right, if we have no further questions, Janet, do you have any comments, questions?
Well, you know, I just want to reiterate that we will be sending the full study and these slides to all the participants. And I think that, you know, to me, you know, going into this with the questions that we had from your, you know, the fire chiefs who requested this, I think that the biggest piece of this that Dr. Trainer's research points out is that there are things that can be done to strengthen organizations. And I think that the recommendations certainly provide food for thought as well as action on how, you know, those in all the responder communities can look to sort of building that stronger camaraderie and stronger sense of purpose might go a long way. It reminded me a lot of probably what the military might be using to keep their troops very united in their mission. So I think that the research and some of the work that Dr. Traynor did on the recommendations are particularly important, because at the end of the day, it's like you said, it's a maybe situation, but the recommendations are pretty clear-cut, and I think certainly could go a long way to making a difference with the first responder and emergency responder communities. So.
All right, we are at 11 o'clock. Dr. Traynor, any final words?
No, I just appreciate it. Again, I appreciate everybody's attention. Anybody who is interested in other questions, things come up, feel free to email me. I think our email is included on the actual report, or give me a call. I'm in my office a lot, so we can glad to answer any other questions that come up along the way.
All right, thank you everybody for participating, and as noted, we will send up the follow-up information. Thank you very much.